Hello. In this video, we are going to discuss Jürgen Habermas, the second generation critical theorist. Jürgen Habermas is a German philosopher, political scientist, and sociologist in the tradition of critical theory, and he is best known for his concept of the public sphere. In this video in particular, we will be focusing on his theory of communicative action and his discourse ethics. In fact, his complex writings span many aspects of social theory and constitute his effort to advance the Enlightenment project to develop human society based on our rational faculty and thus free people from irrational superstition and intolerance. He has warned that society faces a crisis as a life world in which our shared values and practices are developed and constantly reaffirmed through communicative action. This has increasingly been dominated by economic and administrative systems that preclude any chance for communication. Nevertheless, Habermas has remained optimistic that the public sphere can be redeveloped and human society can advance to a better state founded on common understanding, caring for the needs of all its members. Let us now focus on his theory of communicative action. To his credit, he has many works. In particular, we have some of his books which are well received, well read. Toward a Rational Society published in 1970, Theory and Practice published in 1973, Post-National Constellation published in 2001, The Divided West published in 2006, The Dialectics of Secularization on Reason and Religion published in 2007. But among all this, his theory of communicative action is the magnum opus, which he published in the year 1985. The theory of communicative action is a critical theory Habermas supports to counter the single-mindedness of Marxist historical materialism in its social criticism. The theory of communicative action recognizes, like Rawls' overlapping consensus and theory of reasonable pluralism, the potential viability of multitude of critical theories. The theory of communicative action necessitates speakers to coordinate their actions and pursue the individual and collective goals on the basis of shared understanding that the goals are inherently reasonable or merit-worthy. Intersubjective communication then becomes the shaping force behind a recognized plurality of critical modes. The theory of communicative action has a decidedly linguistic bent, as it defines speech acts as relying on reasons and justification for their truth claims to be valid. By creating the need for the speaker to justify themselves, Habermas creates a specific definition of acceptable speech that can be validly implemented within the theory of communicative action. Speakers agree because they are motivated by rational justifications, and their arguments are valid because they are so justified. Communicative action, however, is not simply limited to discourse and reaching an agreement on the substance of norms. Coordinating actions through discourse is also part of the theory. Habermas therefore distinguishes communicative action in a social context from the strategic action. What does strategic action do? Strategic action seeks to fulfill an agenda and not necessarily come to the most rational conclusion through discourse. The point of strategic action is to convince others to agree on an action that will lead to success for those involved. Strategic actions are either open or concealed. If a strategic action is open, then all the participants in the discourse are aware of the underlying strategic motive. If it is concealed, then at least one participant incorrectly believes the action to be communicative when it is known by the rest to be actually strategic. In contrast, communicative action is not based on success, but it consists of attempts by different actors to coordinatively define the context of their interaction in such a way as to enable them to pursue their individual plans. It is a paradigmatic form of social action oriented towards reaching understanding. Now, this theory of communicative action underlies both Habermasian ethics and his politics. In this video, now that we have understood the theory of communicative action, we shall try to pay our attention on the Habermasian ethics, commonly called discourse ethics. In order to govern the effective utilization of communicative action, Habermas developed this discourse ethics. Discourse ethics assumes that the moral norms that are subjectively held apply intersubjectively, but may necessitate rational discourse, in other words, communicative action, in order to influence the formation or reformation of moral norms. To this end, Habermas formulated three general principles. These general principles are universalization principle, discourse principle, and consensus principle. Universalization principle means for a norm to be valid, the consequences and side effects that its general observance can be expected to have for the satisfaction of the particular interests of each person affected must be such that all affected can accept them freely. That is the meaning of universalization principle, which is different from the Kantian understanding of universalization principle. The second principle is the discourse principle. Only those norms can claim to be valid that meet or could meet with the approval of all affected in their capacity as participants in a practical discourse. The third principle is consensus principle. Free participation in a discourse is necessary to formulate a viable and acceptable consensus on an issue. I repeat each of these principles once again. First, universalization principle. For a norm to be valid, the consequences and side effects that its general observance can be expected to have for the satisfaction of the particular interests of each person affected must be such that all affected can accept them freely. Second, discourse principle. Only those norms can claim to be valid that meet or could meet with the approval of all affected in their capacity as participants in a practical discourse. The third, consensus principle. Free participation in discourse is necessary to formulate a viable and acceptable consensus on an issue. These three principles represent respectively freedom, equality, and consensus. The first principle represents freedom, the second principle, discourse principle, represents equality, and the consensus principle obviously represents consensus. The only ethical way for a rational intersubjective discourse to test the validity of a norm is through universalization, discourse, and consensus. As an ethical theory, discourse ethics has certain elements in common with the philosophies of both Kant and Rawls. The three principles of discourse ethics are formulated in a manner similar to that of Kant's categorical imperative, but are given a decidedly dialogical twist in order to apply intersubjectively. In Kant, it is monological and therefore it is very subjective. Habermas is concerned with the number of rational individuals interacting in order to come to valid conclusions about norms. Rawls' philosophy seeks to provide the most just moral framework for a society. In this way, it is similar to discourse ethics. However, Rawls uses his thought experiments to actually produce moral content and reach independent conclusions. Rawls uses the thought experiment like the original position. Habermas is concerned with the procedure of finding valid norms which are moral, not necessarily the content of the norms themselves, but the validity of the moral norms. Discourse ethics is a way of finding what is moral, while universalization, discourse, and consensus may be said to contain inherent moral elements, namely equality, freedom, and consensus. Their structures are necessary in order to guarantee the maximal inclusion and expression of intersubjective argumentative discourses drawn from the maximal amount of Rawlsian comprehensive doctrines. Thus, universalization, discourse, and consensus exist in order to optimize the efficacy of the theory of communicative action and not moral norms in themselves, although they may be said to presuppose them. This much is basically the general idea of the theory of communicative action as well as the discourse ethics of Habermas. In another video, I will discuss with you his politics, namely his understanding of democracy, which is commonly known as the discursive model of democracy. Thank you very much.